So nice to see everybody to the first, in fact, Fellows lecture of that cohort of that spring 2023. And I'm very grateful, Anselm, that you're on the first position on that row. So yeah, you're really the first one presenting in that spring. So thanks a lot for that. Hi. Before Anselm starts, I'd like to give a couple of words as an introduction, since it's tradition here. Professor Anselm Hagedorn is at the moment one of our Göttingen professors, and he's a really international scholar, and you can see that already from his undergraduate time. He studied in Göttingen, in St. Andrews in Scotland, in Heidelberg and in Notre Dame in the US, and he then received his PhD from the University of Oxford in Old Testament with a thesis that was entitled Between Moses and Plato, Individual and Society in Deuteronomy and Ancient Greek Law. He then taught in Berlin, in Göttingen and in Heidelberg, and I believe in 2014 you were appointed full professor for Hebrew Bible and Ancient Judaism at the University of Osnabrück in the north of Germany. Very nice place if you're ever there. You will see that in his lecture today that Anselm is also really interested in the material culture in archaeology. He is cooperating in an excavation since 2019 together with Tel Aviv University, with Oleg Lipschitz and Shua Kesevich in Tel Moza. Fantastic site. We've visited in the last semester, and I believe you're also staying longer actually for the field season that will be in June. So that's exciting. If you have questions on that, and the stratigraphy here is somebody to ask. During his professorship here at the Albright, Anselm focuses, or his research focuses on the Song of the Songs. And in this regard, he's very interested in the social world that is created in the text, in the context of the Eastern Mediterranean world, in the late Persian, early Hellenistic period. That's sort of the time frame we are looking at also today. And he also includes archaeological data, but not only to illuminate sort of parts of the Hebrew Bible, but to really reconstruct the settings of this poem. And so you see this close connection between somebody who works on the text and is equally in the field. We will look into gardens today, and I had a little sneak preview this morning. I'm really excited and looking forward to that. Thanks a lot for making this happen, and you all enjoy the lecture.
Thank you, Katharina, for a very nice and pleasant introduction. Of course, when you're the first one giving the paper, you can be so boring that everybody else can just like, no, it's only going to get up from there. So that's a very nice thing. And the other thing is, as you will see from my lecture today, I'm really incredibly not an archaeologist. So everything I talk about archaeology is, of course, secondhand, or as Odette and Shua always say at the dig, we are doing the archaeology, you're doing logistics and discipline, and I think that's absolutely right. So I'm want to talk to you this afternoon about gardens between text and archaeology, a perspective from a Song of Songs. And since we are at the Albright, I thought, has Albright ever done anything on the Song of Songs? And in fact, he has. There's one article I'm aware of. It's called Archaic Survivals in the Text of Canticles, from a Festschrift in honor of J.R. Driver in 1963. Previously, if you do a bit of excavation in Albright's manifold publications, there's about half a paragraph in another Festschrift article for Theodore H. Robinson in 46, where he really briefly deals with Song of Songs. 7:1-2. In the Driver-Festschrift, however, Albright hopes to investigate several striking archaisms, as he calls it in the text, and the article is really a very careful philological analysis of several passages from the Song of Songs, showing how good a philologist Albright can be if he chooses to do so. And one wonders why he doesn't do this more often. Right at the beginning, he tells his readers where he wants to situate his contribution. I quote, "Contrary to assertions in the past that there's not a single Greek loanword, and therefore there is no evidence for the frequently assumed Hellenistic date. A date in the 5th to 4th century BC for the collection and editing of canticles thus appears certain." End of quote. This statement, just right on the first page there, is a very subtle stab against Moses Hadas, whose striking and elegant study on the diffusion of Greek culture, published in 1959, firmly situated Song of Songs in the context of the Eastern Mediterranean. What surprised me about this article by Albright is his ability to maintain a very early date for several passages from the Song of Songs, and his acute awareness that much of the book simply cannot be late. Remember, he can be a philologist if he wants to. He attributes this phenomenon to, I quote, "the taste and collector's enthusiasm of our unknown scribe or scribes," and continues, I quote, "our collector's care should also be commended, since he apparently never conflated his fragments of transmitted lyrics in such a way as to combine Iranian," he means Persian, "and other obviously late expressions with archaic style and mythical imagery." End of quote. Needless to say, I differ from Albright in my assessment of the material, as I doubt that we can find late Bronze Age survivals in biblical texts, but I have to say that I'm using his argument for an assertive key in Song of Songs 1:4, because I think he's right there. So let me begin using Albright as a point of departure with a couple of presuppositions that guide my approach and interpretation of the Song of Songs. For me, Song of Songs is an anthology of secular love poems that praises a form of love between man and woman that is removed from the conventions and pressures of society. In my opinion, to regard Song of Songs as an anthology enables me to pay attention to larger units and structures without having to postulate a literary unity of the text. Following Cheryl Axon, I see the male and female protagonists of the Song of Songs as representing all lovers. Therefore, in my opinion, it is futile to try to identify the speakers with Solomon, the Shulamite, a shepherd, a shepherdess, and you name it. The poetry of the book is highly stylized. The numerous allusions to literary texts of the ancient Near East and the Greek culture around make it seem unlikely that we're dealing with folk literature here. So I'm trying to situate it away from this 19th century interpretive frame that we have some sort of rural poetry here. Instead, the poems seem, at least to me, to imitate this form of poetry, and therefore I regard them as very close to bucolic literature, and they're representing an idealized pastoral world. The language of the song can be classified as a late form of biblical Hebrew, and that makes it, in my opinion, a pre-exilic date highly unlikely. It appears that the authors of the poem want to participate in an international world, and this, at least for me, seems to point more to the Hellenistic period of the anthology than to any earlier period. But you will see when we're talking about the archaeology that there could be other possibilities. Though I'm not negating the role of metaphors in the Song of Songs, I'm advocating what I'm calling a minimal metaphor approach that deliberately shifts the interpretation away from metaphoric language towards a closer understanding of the social world, real or evoked, created by the text, and how this world can be informed and shaped by archaeological data. As such, my approach, in a way, joins the new interest of classical studies in the cognitive world created by archaic Greek lyric. You can attach a fancy label to it, and if you do so, you can call this approach, of course, text world theory, i.e. a theory which recognizes distinction between the world of the discourse, i.e. where discourse happens, and the world of the text created in the minds of the participants of the discourse. And that's something that will be very important to me, that we have a world the author lives in, and then we have a world the author deliberately creates to evoke in images, etc. So this is what I'm trying to do. I will argue that the cultural background and information available to the participants is not necessarily reflected in the text, but can be. The theory furthermore acknowledges that the text world can change as discourse progresses, especially when there is a shift in the main coordinates, temporal, spatial, and personal. When dealing with the written text, the discourse world is necessarily split in the audience, or the reader occupies a separate, special, and temporal location from the author. So, why are we talking about gardens then? I want to progress within 3 steps. First of all, I'm going to talk about gardens as third space. Then I will look briefly at a couple of texts from Song of Songs. And then in a third step, let's have a look at the archaeological record of what we can discern from it and how we can use it for our interpretation of the song. At the beginning of Book 7 of the Odyssey, Odysseus, after having prayed to Athena in a grove dedicated to her, rather reluctantly makes his way towards the palace of King Alcinous and Queen Arete. He has been away from civilization for more than 7 years, when he was Calypso's prisoner, and it stands to reason that he must steel himself to appear and interact at a noble court once more. The challenge is intensified by the Phaeacians' reputation for being reclusive to the extreme. These exotic people portrayed by Homer have held themselves apart from the world and its conflicts, most notably the Trojan War, residing quietly on the distant island of Scheria, which ancient tradition already identifies with the island of Kerkyra or Corfu. Thanks to some trickery from Athena, who grants him a shroud of invisibility as he makes his way unseen through the city gates, and so he arrives at the palace gates, and I read from Emily Wilson's marvelous translation. Odysseus approached the royal house and stood there by the threshold made of bronze. His heart was mulling over many things. Outside the courtyard by the door there grows an orchard of 4 acres, hedged around. The trees are tall, luxuriant with fruit. Bright-colored apples, pears, and pomegranate, sweet figs and fertile olives, and the crop never runs out or withers in the winter, nor in the summer. Fruit grows all year round. The west wind always blows and makes it swell and ripen, mellowing pear on mellowing pear, apple on apple, grapes on grapes, and figs. A fertile vineyard, too, is planted there. They use the warmer side, a flattened slope, for drying grapes in sunshine. They pick bunches and trample them, while unripe clusters open and shed their blooms, and others turns to purple. There are 2 springs, one flows all through the garden, the other gushes from the courtyard threshold towards the palace, and the people draw fresh water. So the gods had blessed the house of King Alcinous with lovely gifts. Hardened, long-suffering Odysseus stood there and stared, astonished in his heart, then quickly strode across the palace threshold. Leaving aside the fact that fruits are mentioned frequently in the Odyssey, but it's never said that people are eating fruit, we note 2 things. First of all, gardens seem to be part of the royal sphere. And secondly, there are reason for amazement, even for a seasoned traveler like Odysseus, and sign of divine favor. So the gods had blessed the house of King Alcinous with lovely gifts. Gardens fascinated people in antiquity, mainly because in a geographical realm where water is mostly a sparse commodity and the weather is often less than favorable, maintaining a garden required special skills and resources. Small wonder then that gardens tend to be associated with the royal court and the divine sphere. Next to the symbols of power, as in the Odyssey, gardens also structure and influence the conception of space. The next slide, you all know, it's a famous garden or temple, royal garden or temple garden depicted in the palace of Ashurbanipal. Following Georg Simmel and Henri Lefebvre, I will be viewing space as a social construct. Still following Lefebvre, I regard spatial practice as an ordering force of everyday life. This ordering aspects of space influences both the perception and the conception of space. As such, gardens occupy, in my opinion, a third space. I use a term coined by Michael Foucault and Homi Bhabha. And though not universally accessible, they are able to structure and influence the perception of reality. And we will see in the course of the paper that for me, the third space is between the inside and the outside, in a way, not really between the public and the private, but on the threshold. So let's look at a couple of texts, gardens in the Song of Songs. In Song of Songs 4:12 to 5:1, we find the fullest description of a garden in the song. A locked garden is my sister bride, a locked garden, a fountain sealed. Your shoots, a paradise of pomegranates with fruits of excellence, henna with nard, nard with saffron, calmus and cinnamon with all trees of incense, myrrh and aloes with all the most precious spices, fountain of the garden, well of living water, indeed flowing from Lebanon. Awake north wind and come south wind, blow through my garden, let its spices spread. Let my beloved come in his garden and taste his fruits of excellence. I have come into my garden, my sister bride. I have gathered my myrrh and my spices. I have eaten my honeycomb with my honey. I have drunk my wine with my milk. Eat, friends, drink, and get drunk by love. The piece is a carefully crafted text, which is highly significant for the shape of the book of the whole. The passage climaxes in what interpreters generally consider the center of the Song of Songs. In Song of Songs 5:1b, a male voice encourages his friends to eat, drink, and literally get intoxicated by love. This central verse is an invitation to the reader of the Song of Songs to become an active part in its pleasures. In addition, the Masoretes indicate that in Song of Songs 4:14, that this passage or this verse has to be seen as the middle of the book. In the pericope itself, the phrases achoti kala and perimegadim form an outer and inner frame. Here, the catchword achoti kala links 4:12 to 5:1 to the preceding Song of Admiration in chapter 4, verses 9 to 11. Within this Song of Admiration, verse 11 can be seen as a transitional verse. So you can see how the text progresses from one short poem to another. The reappearance of the Lebanon, already mentioned in chapter 3 and earlier in chapter 4, indicates a transition towards nature and the outside, and generally pointing to the Noselim in Lebanon in 4:15. While this kind of eating and drinking, the consumption in verse 5a, really draws the reader in to participate. I have eaten my honeycomb with my honey. I have drunk my wine with my milk. Again, a reference back to an earlier verse in 4:11. And then, of course, the exhortation, eat, drink, etc. After the classification of the beloved as a locked garden and a sealed fountain in 4:12, the main part of the poem is devoted to the description of a sumptuous garden, echoing imagery that will reappear in the ekphraseis known from classical romances. And if you listen carefully to Homer Odyssey 7, there seems to be a stockpile of ways how to describe a garden that seem to reappear here. The double use of the phrase Gan Nahum, closed garden, stresses the exclusivity of access to this private pleasure garden. As is well known, the Latin translation of this verse, hortus conclusus, sora mea sponsor, hortus conclusus fons signatus, forms the point of origin for the Christian allegory of Mary as being a closed garden, i.e. virgin. And if you Google closed garden, this is what comes up. Here I find heaps of pictures with a lock, with a locked garden gate, and then you find heaps of pictures of Mary. The rabbis equally stress the virginity of Israel when explaining the phrase, but do not give up sexual connotations entirely. When Song of Songs Rabbah reports the teaching of Rabbi Nathan, who expounds the phrase, a garden locked, a fountain sealed, as follows, I quote, one refers to vaginal, the other one to anal intercourse, end of quote. One gets the feeling when one reads the rabbis on the Song of Songs that they're much more in touch with reality than the Christian interpreters. But this is something for a totally different lecture project, etc. I won't even go in there. Even the allegorical readings of Song of Songs 4:12 maintain something of the original intention of the text, as they too express the lure, the promise, and the enigma connected with the female body, as well as the desires attached to it. Reality and fantasy are blurred in the description of the garden, as the man literally envisages a paradise, Hebrew, or Albright would say Iranian paradise, appears in the text, that is stocked with several exotic plants that are not native to Palestine. The vocabulary points to a utopian fantasy garden, or does it? We will return to that. As in Greek thought, the plant's distinctive botanical characteristics tend to become blurred in the mythical accounts in which they are linked together, encompassed by a single boundary. It is not the fruit that matter, but only their pleasant smells and aromas. Here it is especially revealing that the man in our passage, in Song of Songs 5:1, only gathers myrrh and spices from his garden, but he eats the things that are not mentioned in the description. The careful avoidance of the ravishing of the garden eschews all connotation of a sexual force. In doing so, the perpetuity of the garden is emphasized, despite the obvious sexual connotations and the pleasures taking place in the garden. It is not a fleeting place, as for example, the gardens of Adonisa. As the love between the two protagonists is never threatened by either jealousy or competing suitors in the Song of Songs, so is the vegetation of the garden never endangered. You had that also already in Odyssey 7, same concept. The description of the garden ends in 4:15. And in 4:16, a speaker commands the winds from the north and the south to blow through the garden. Who is speaking in the first half of the verse is not entirely clear, and only in the second half of verse 16 do we hear the voice of the woman. Again, I would argue that this verse marks a transition. The spreading of the spices by the winds triggers the entry into the garden by the man, who then literally smells and tastes its pleasures. As it's obvious that the garden is an erotic metaphor for the woman, it is possible that it is a woman who speaks the verse in 16. At least that's what I'm trying to propose in the commentary, but I'm not there yet. The aromas spread by the winds are then a powerful agent, as they emit the irresistible appeal of perfume, which brings together the most distance of beings, or else provoke an essential adolescent to extreme sexual potency in the seducer, or as one wants to use a metaphor from Marcel Détienne, they evoke a hypersexuality in women. I'm not so sure about that, but for here, it's quite obvious that there's something going on. Gardens, and this is the whole point of this afternoon, have captured the attention of literary and cultural critics over the past 10 years. There's really a plethora of studies on gardens and their cultural significance. Here, the interest moves beyond horticultural investigation and addresses questions of social and anthropological structure. Gardens can be characterized as forming an intimate space and a place for love of both human and plants, as it is, for example, the case in a very late text, the Dionysiaca of Nonnos, where we read, I quote, "Before the house there is a courtyard. Near the courtyard was an enclosure, widespread, 4 acres, of trees heavy with fresh fruit. Male palm stretched his leaves over female palm, pledging love." End of quote. Since flowers and plants are seen as a work of Eros, it is not surprising that in the Greek novel of the Hellenistic period, gardens and love can collapse into each other. Additionally, feminist theory has drawn attention to the fact that gardens often represent a liminal place, i.e., being situated on the border between private and public spaces. They are fantasized about as hideaways, sanctuaries in which a female self can develop without social constraints and the norms of femininity. The garden, however, is to be separated from the locus amoenos and the ideal landscape of Greek bucolic poetry by being an artificial enclosure with borders. And that's very important. The artificial nature of gardens is much more, it says something else than the bucolic landscape you have, for example, in Theocritus and Longus and all these others. As such, the garden appears to be a meta place or a third space, i.e. a space that in itself represents the border between wild landscape and the enclosed space of a house. Bucolic poetry tries to domesticate the wild. That's quite obvious. For example, if you read Theocritus, Theocritus Idyll number 2, it's set in the wild, but the wild is domesticated. But here, the garden is really something, it is the border, because both things, the wild and the domestic, are joined in an enclosed space. In our passage here, the outside world is symbolized by the living waters flowing from Lebanon. The waters flowing from Lebanon evoke mythical images, and Lebanon in the Song of Songs does not describe a romantic place of love. Rather, it can be a cipher for the wilderness, or have a positive connotation, stressing the exquisite character of the beloved, as is the case in 4:11, just shortly before. I would argue that this ambivalent attitude towards the Lebanon points to an attempt to domesticate the outside world that threatens to intrude upon the garden. A similar strategy is employed in Longo's pastoral novel Daphnis and Chloe, when he places the garden of Deinasophanes in such a way that it's possible to overlook the outside world. Remember that, overlooking the outside world, because we will need that for our archaeological side of the talk. I quote, "From here one had a beautiful view over the plain and was able to observe the herdsmen therein. Equally beautiful was the view over the sea, where one saw those who sailed past. Thus the pleasant view was also part of the delights of the garden." Looking out from the garden is something that's very important as much as looking in is. In contrast to other parts of the ancient novel, where the outside world is full of danger for the loving couple, here the world is simply transformed into being an object that literally paints the background for a paradise-like garden in Longus. In both cases, it becomes obvious that the production of space does not operate with binary opposites such as inside versus outside, garden versus wilderness. As mentioned above, the existence of the garden is never threatened, neither from outside forces nor from the inside. In Song of Songs 6:2, where the beloved man is transformed into a stag grazing amongst lotuses, a peaceful vision of intense delight is created. My beloved has gone down to his garden, to the beds of spices, to graze in the garden and gather lotuses. I am my beloved and my beloved is mine, grazing among the lotuses. The formulaic use of anile dodi velodidi by the woman in connection with the image of grazing expresses the lovers' total absorption in each other and paints the potential destructive impetus of grazing as the deepest understanding of belonging. It's an amazing thing that grazing is like, it's destructive. You eat the stuff. But here, it's not the case. The imagined space of the garden is finally transformed into a female entity when we read in Song of Songs 6:11, I went down to the nut garden to look at the blossoms of the valley, to see if the vine had budded, if the pomegranates had bloomed. Otherwise being masculine in the Song of Songs, we now encounter a female nut garden, the ginat egos. The verse is a description of an experience of the man and is more reserved than the previous passages. Instead of grazing, plucking, or eating, he is simply looking here, expressing his desire. The blossoming of nature echoes the description of the awakening of spring and love in other passages of Song of Songs. As in the previous text 4:12 to 5:1, the place is an exotic garden, but it is described as ginat egos. The fruit, the nut, was held in antiquity to have potent possibilities for love, just like the pomegranate. Probably, and here modern exegetes tend to speculate because of the shape which recalls the female organ. Well, Catholics love that thing, love that verse. Sorry, quip, don't write that down. So the literary creation of a garden, however, as we have encountered in the Song of Songs, prompts the question where the author could have got his or her horticultural knowledge from. And this will lead me to the third part of my paper, Gardens, an Archaeological Perspective. Though we have ample evidence for gardens in the ancient Near East and Egypt, archaeological evidence for gardens is sparse in Israel and Judah before the Roman period. Of course, you probably all know the Herodian palace at Jericho, and you also know that there was probably a garden in Samaria. It's the Kathleen Kenyon and Sukenik aren't quite clear in their report, but they talk about something that could have been a garden. The Bible, of course, mentions Eden and the Gan Yarag, probably a spice garden, into which Ahab wants to transform Naboth's vine vineyard. Additionally, there's the king's garden that serves as a burial ground for King Manasseh and may be a pleasure garden. I'm speculating here. Unfortunately, these passages provide little detail about the structure and vegetation of these gardens, and the same is true for the other text mentioning gardens. It seems to be one knows what a garden looks like, so one doesn't really have to describe it. Eden, we bracket out for the moment. I would have loved to use evidence from Moza now, but as we haven't yet found the garden at Moza, and I doubt that we will, I'm going to look at another Tel Aviv excavation, namely the excavation of Ramat Rachel. From 2005 to 2010, the universities of Tel Aviv and Heidelberg conducted renewed excavations at a site originally excavated by Yohanan Aharoni in the late 50s and early 60s. This is not the place to review the results of this recent campaign, as reports are fully published. You see them here. If you don't want to plow through archaeological records, there's also a marvelous coffee table picture book, or that is going to kill me because I call it a coffee table book. What are the stones whispering? It's a marvelous production of the archaeological excavation for a broader audience. So I will limit myself to some remarks on the geographical place. The site is located on a prominent summit. The archaeological report calculates 818 meters above sea level between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. As the hill is one of the highest peaks in the area south of Jerusalem, it is an ideal location for fortress and/or watchtower, and thus in direct control of the road that leads into Jerusalem from the south, i.e. from Beersheba, Hebron, and Bethlehem, as well as of the road leading to Jerusalem from the west, Beit Shemesh. The place provides an ideal outlook to the north, west, and south. We can distinguish 9 separate phases of construction and development from the 8th century BCE onwards. According to the excavators, the site can be best described as an administrative complex, I quote, used as a tax collection center, serving the empires, controlling the kingdom of Judah and the later province of Judah. That's very important. That's an administrative center. Oded Lipschitz and David van der Hooft have published all these Lemelech stamps and all these stamped handles to show that what we have here, it really has to do with collecting taxes. What is important for our enterprise today is the insight that the western face of the palace and tower had been surrounded by a luxurious garden complex. This is area C1. This is working out, situated here of the excavation complex. That's a picture of an aerial picture of the excavation. It's not really that focused because I couldn't one blow up properly. But since Ramat Rachel is literally a bus ride away, you step on bus 66 here and gets you there. You should go. It's very interesting. The size of the garden area, i.e. this one here, is about 5 dunams, and it was clearly created artificially. We can see that a bit better here. According to the excavators, the quarrying activities in the area and the complete removal of the hard Nari rock layer from the uppermost natural surface enabled the creation of a leveled uniform limestone surface, the geological layer below it. After the completion of the quarrying and leveling work, the surface was covered with a 45 to 55 centimeter thick uniform layer of brown chocolate-like garden soil. This is a term the excavators use from Kathleen Kenyon and Sue Koenig's report in Samaria, because they're already talking about chocolate-like earth. This soil layer was discovered over a wide area around the western part of the palace, and it is clean earth, free of stones and of pottery shards, proving that it was well sifted before. And you can see it here. I mean, this stretches around here. You can't see it now because there's later plantations here. But this smooth surface has not been created by either JCB or the excavators. That is the surface of that artificial garden. It was artificially laid on the earth, chocolate-like earth, on the clean-cut chalk surface. Into this uniform surface, plots and flower beds were inserted and integrated into the complex system for storing and transporting water, which included pools, channels, and drain pipes. This is, in fact, kind of getting sidetracked here now. This is a pool here, for example, and there's another one over here. This is really the amazing bit about Ramat Rachel, how they negotiate water and water use in an area which is arid and where we don't have any kind of artificial transportation from water from somewhere else, unless you want to assume they put amphoras or donkeys and carry it, yeah, which I find a bit strange. It's really just they're saving the rainwater and channeling the rainwater. The garden was built on the western part of the mount on which the site was established. You see it here. This is what my PhD student does when we ask him nicely. He's doing 3D reconstruction. This is a 3D reconstruction looking southeast of the palace. And you see the garden here going around here. And there's another one looking northeast, where you can really see that this garden stretches around the building. What Roy Albright does in his reconstructions, he only reconstructs things where we have actually archaeological evidence for. Yeah, so especially on the ground level. So he's not trying to create archaeological Disneyland. It's all based on the archaeological reports. The garden was built in the western part of the mount on which the site was established. This part of the valley of the site is highly visible from the north, west, and south, and it's easily identified from most parts of the Rephaim Valley and wide areas south and west of Jerusalem. So this looking out, which we had in Longus, Daphnis, and Chloe, is now exactly the opposite, looking at or looking in. For anyone viewing the site from afar, the presence of trees and greenery on top of the height peak within the arid Judean desert in the background must literally have been eye-catching. As the aim of monumental architecture is to impress power and authority on the viewer, the visibility of the site in general and the garden specifically plays a key role in this context. If the garden had been built on the eastern part of the site, its impact on the landscape and in fact the wondrous vision observed by the local population would have been drastically diminished. as Odette Lipschitz wrote in one of the excavation reports. Though already in existence during the Assyrian and Babylonian period, the garden was distinctly reconstructed during the Persian period, which is in archaeological terms for Ramat Rachel, building phase 3. This reconstruction and rebuilding would fit very well with a note in Xenophon's Cyropedia, where it is stated that the Persian king decreed that there should be a royal garden. Xenophon calls it by the Persian word, a paradise, in every province. And maybe Ramat Rachel was exactly that. Of special interest, at least for me, is the vegetation of the garden. A palynological analysis based on fossilized pollen sampled from the plaster in the garden's water pool clearly indicated that local and imported plant species were cultivated in the garden. So what do we have? We have willow, poplar, grapevine, olive, fig, myrtle, lotus, water lilies, the lemon tree, birch, and the Persian walnut, Douglas regia. First of all, the variety of plants is remarkable, and so is the choice of the plants. There seemed to be a mixture of agricultural crop, i.e. vine, fig, and walnut, and ornamental flowers, water lily, and so on. I don't think that that such a mixture points to a concrete agricultural use of the garden. This is not a garden as we would understand a garden, where there's an apple tree and there's a cherry tree and you have a couple of onions and whatever, a couple of potatoes. No, this is something different. This garden was planted because of the looks and the smell of exoticism. This seems to govern the choice. Like high trees as well as vegetation that oozes a pleasant smell. The wide variety of plants shows that what we have here, we need knowledge about different ways of gardening practice. And that probably already points to a highly trained staff. For example, water lilies or lotuses need water, obviously. Olive, well, needs some water, but can also survive dry patches, etc. So whoever tended that garden had to be a specialist. The pollen evidence suggests that the plants were brought to the palatial garden by the rural Persian authorities from remote places of the empire as some form of royal or imperial extravagance. As far as a Song of Songs is concerned, the excavations from Ramat Rachel, of course, provide amazing insights. Here you have a reconstruction of the garden at Ramat Rachel, how the planting had worked. First of all, the reconstructed garden offers us a unique possibility of comparison. As, for example, that we have here the first time attested walnut in Palestine. It's the first time that we can actually pin it down. That would, of course, make the Ginat Egos of Song of Songs 6 a bit problematic in the Bronze Age period. Just say. Yeah. So clearly this helps our understanding. Also, in a very well-known long discussion about Hebrew tapuach in Song of Songs and elsewhere, normally translated as apple, we have a long tradition that it was thought to be the lemon, etrog, which is normally, as far as Song of Songs is concerned, quickly dismissed because the lemon arrives later. Well, lemon does not arrive later. Lemon, we have at least we have lemons in the garden of Ramat Rachel. So why not? Yeah, I mean, I would stick with the interpretation of tapuach being apple for various other reasons, but again, that's also a different paper. As the garden in Ramat Rachel was meant to inspire awe and veneration of the might and wealth of their creators, the authors of Song of Songs may want to do the same when the man, like a king or member of an elite, takes access to his garden for granted. Yeah? The stress on the privacy and exclusivity, however, remember the closed garden, seems to distinguish Song of Songs from Ramat Rachel, which has to do with the structure and how the garden at Ramat Rachel is fitted into the imperial architecture. The description of the garden can be understood as being both actual places that exist in the imagination of the speaker and reader, or more or less veiled references to the beloved woman. We've already spoken about that. If that is the case, the construction of space in the Song of Songs would affect both the description of the beloved person as well as the place the beloved occupies. The evidence from Ramat Rachel certainly helps to uncover and to understand bits and pieces of the materiality of the Song of Songs, but, and that's very important, I don't think it's possible to argue that the authors of the Song of Songs ever visited Ramat Rachel. I mean, that's something. It would be nice, but if you look, and this is where the archaeological record of the materiality actually helps. If you put the description of the garden in Song of Songs next to what we archaeological know about Ramat Rachel, it becomes quite obvious that whoever is writing Song of Songs is really going a step further. You see, all these spices Song of Songs mentions, we don't have any evidence for at Ramat Rachel. Also, as gardens became more and more extravagant after the Persian period, then, strangely enough, the garden of Ramat Rachel was no longer in existence. We can show that in the Hellenistic period, this Persian paradise fell out of use. And the garden in the Song of Songs seems to surpass the historian reconstruction. Ramat Rachel may provide a terminus post quem for the development of garden imagery, at least in this particular biblical text. As the gardens from the Hasmonean and Herodian period expand on architectural features known from Ramat Rachel, so does a Song of Song merge Persian period imagery with later features. When you look at the gardens of Herod at Jericho, for example, and this massive display of power, wealth, and exoticism, you can see that it started at Ramat Rachel, but then got really developed further and further and further. And at Jericho, at the palaces of Herod and Jericho, we even have the planting pots, how they brought the plants in and put them in. And you can see in the architecture of the garden much more than you can do in Ramat Rachel, that it really wants to impress visitors. I mean, Ramat Rachel looks impressive. I mean, this is how it could have looked. Again, thanks to Roy Albright, and it has a distinct feel in an arid climate of a paradise. And there's no reason. There's a reason for it why we're still using that Persian word. The author creates for his readers, I think, in the Song of Songs, a royal sphere to which they have access. And at the same time, he envisages, like the creators of gardens, a paradise on earth to which one can escape to from the constraints of society. And how this is done, you can see in modern time Israel, there is a garden according to the Song of Songs at Bar Ilan. Here you have the plan. It is impressive, but it also plays around a bit with the idea. And for example, the walled garden is just like tiny little wooden bench, stone benches where you can sit around the pool. It's very nice, but it kind of, the description of the garden in Song of Songs stimulates readers. And for the authors of the Song of Songs, they want to create a royal world. It's quite obvious. And all the others, maybe we just want to create a paradise on earth, but that's a topic for a different paper. So thank you for your patience. And I love this last bit. This is a full picture of the stand that's on the that was on the poster. It quotes Song of Songs 6:11. gone down to the nut garden and deliberately uses hazelnuts rather than walnuts. But I'll leave you to speculate why this is done by the post office. Thank you very much for your patience.